I still remember the exact moment the room decided I didn't matter. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was quieter than that. A sideways glance, a sigh, the kind of smile people use when they've already made up their mind about you. I was standing near the wall, hands sweating, heart beating way too fast for someone who technically wasn't even part of the meeting. And yet, somehow, everything that was about to happen hinged on whether I spoke up or stayed invisible like I'd been trained to do my whole life. Let me back up a little. My name doesn't matter much here, so let's call me Alex. I grew up learning early how to take up as little space as possible. We didn't have much money, and we didn't have connections. My mom cleaned offices downtown, the kind with glass walls and leather chairs and people who talked about numbers like they were talking about weather. I'd sometimes wait for her after school, sitting in empty break rooms doing homework, listening to voices drift through hallways I wasn't meant to walk down. What most people didn't know was that my little sister Maya was born deaf. And from the moment we realized that my world changed. I was 8 years old, scared out of my mind, watching doctors explain things my mom pretended to understand so she wouldn't fall apart in front of us. At home, when everything was quiet, she cried. Not because she didn't love Maya, but because she knew exactly how cruel the world could be to someone who couldn't hear it coming. So I learned. Slowly, at first, awkwardly. Library books, online videos, late nights practicing signs in the mirror while everyone else slept. I learned because someone had to be Maya's bridge, and it sure wasn't going to be the world. Over time, sign language stopped feeling like a skill and started feeling like another heartbeat. It became instinct. It became my way of making sure my sister was never invisible. Years later, that instinct followed me somewhere it had no business being. That morning, my mom had been asked to stay late to clean an executive floor. Big meeting, important people, lots of coffee stains and trash left behind. I tagged along because my after-school program was closed and I knew the rules. Stay quiet, stay out of sight, don't touch anything. I did all of that right up until I heard raised voices behind a glass door I shouldn't have been near. Inside was a boardroom, massive table, men and women in expensive clothes, and at the head of it sat an older woman named Margaret Hale. She was the founder of the company, a legend, a billionaire if you read the magazines. She was also deaf. Completely. Her son was beside her trying to translate her signing and doing a terrible job of it. Not maliciously, not intentionally, just badly. He kept summarizing, softening, skipping things he didn't fully understand. And across from him sat a man I'd later come to know as Victor Crane, the kind of executive who smiled with his mouth and sneered with his eyes. Victor kept interrupting, dismissing Margaret's points, calling them unrealistic, emotional, outdated. At one point, he chuckled and said something like, "Maybe we should stick to numbers and let the grown-ups handle the strategy." The room laughed politely. Margaret's hands moved faster, sharper. No one was really watching them. That's when my stomach dropped. Because I knew exactly what she was saying and I knew exactly how wrong her son's translation was. She wasn't being vague or sentimental. She was being precise. She was explaining risk management, long-term value, community investment tied directly to brand stability. She was making sense. More sense than anyone else in that room. I told myself to stay quiet. I told myself I was just a kid. I told myself this wasn't my place. I'd told myself that my whole life. Then Victor leaned forward and said loud enough for everyone, "This is getting embarrassing." Something snapped. I spoke before I fully decided to. That's not what she said. Every head turned. 20 pairs of eyes landed on me like I'd thrown a rock through the window. Someone asked who I was. Someone else asked why I was there. Victor laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Is this a daycare now?" Margaret looked at me. Really looked at me. And then she signed a single question, slow and clear. "Do you understand me?" My hands answered before my brain caught up. Yes. Completely. The room went dead quiet. Her son looked confused. Victor looked annoyed. Someone suggested calling security, but Margaret raised her hand firm, authoritative, and signed again. She wanted me to translate. Victor objected immediately. Called it inappropriate. Said this wasn't a game. Then he smiled, that sharp smile, and made it a bet. If I messed up, my mom would lose her job. If I got it right, he'd donate money to charity. He was so sure I'd fail, you could taste it. My mom appeared in the doorway, pale, terrified, whispering my name. I wanted to run to her. I wanted to disappear. But Margaret was watching me with a look I recognized. The same look Maya got when she was tired of being ignored. So I stayed. Margaret began to sign slowly at first, then with confidence. I translated everything. The project scope, the numbers, the contingencies. When Victor tried to trip her up with complex hypotheticals, I made sure the question was actually understood before she answered. And her answers, they were brilliant, calculated, prepared. She'd already accounted for risks Victor was pretending to discover. I could feel the power shifting. People leaned forward. Phones went down, laptops closed. One woman on the board started typing furiously, pulling up documents verifying numbers I was translating in real time. Every time I finished a sentence, Margaret watched the room like she was finally being allowed to exist again. Victor grew louder, more aggressive. He accused me of lying, of memorizing documents, of being coached. When that didn't work, he questioned Margaret's mental competence, said her disability made her vulnerable, manipulable. That was the moment her expression hardened. She signed something slowly, deliberately, with a calm that scared me more than anger ever could. She'd noticed financial discrepancies months ago. She'd hired an independent auditor. The report was already in the room. When that envelope came out, everything fell apart for Victor. Fake expenses, shell companies, millions siphoned off quietly. The same man lecturing about responsibility had been stealing blind, assuming no one would notice. Assuming she couldn't notice. He tried one last time to regain control, looked at me and said I'd end up just like my mother cleaning floors knowing my place. The words stung, but they also freed me. I told him I didn't belong in rooms where people like him made decisions. But Margaret did. My sister did. And so did everyone he'd dismissed. Security walked him out. The vote passed unanimously. The project was approved. But what stayed with me wasn't the applause or the headlines that came later. It was the quiet moment after when Margaret signed thank you and meant it in a way that had nothing to do with business. When my mom hugged me like she was holding on to solid ground for the first time in years. When people in that room admitted they hadn't listened because it was easier not to. That day didn't turn me into a hero. It reminded me I already had a voice. I'd just been taught not to use it. So here's what I want to know from you. Have you ever watched someone be dismissed because it was convenient? Have you ever stayed quiet when you knew better? Or have you been the one people talked over, underestimated, pushed aside? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Argue if you want. Agree if you want. But don't ignore the question. Because sometimes justice doesn't arrive loudly. Sometimes it walks in quietly, waits too long, and then finally decides to speak.